December 18, 1944. A biting winter wind cuts across the shattered landscape of Aachen, the first German city to fall into Allied hands. The streets are broken veins of rubble and twisted steel. Snow clings to the edges of collapsed homes. Smoke hangs low, crawling like a living thing over the ruins. In the shadows, children with hollow eyes watch foreign soldiers in heavy coats trudge through the wreckage. They expect nothing but the bark of orders, the rifle butt or the steel hunger of confiscation. Instead, the Americans kneel down and press into their trembling hands something unimaginable, a piece of chocolate, a stick of gum. The children stare. Their mothers do not believe. For years, everything edible had been stripped away by war, ration or fear. Yet here in the heart of a ruined Reich, enemies were giving gifts. U.S. Army Signal Corps report, DEC 1944. The scene was as startling as it was symbolic. To civilians who had been told the Americans were barbaric invaders, uncaring, merciless, the offering of candy became a dissonant shock. Leaflets from Goebbels' propaganda ministry had warned of Allied atrocities. But reality was different. Allied soldiers, weary from bloodshed, sought moments of humanity in the faces of starving children. The war was not only fought with artillery and firestorms, it was waged in gestures, in the daily grind of supply chains, and in the smallest interactions between occupier and occupied. Bundesarchiv Propaganda Leaflets 1944. By the winter of 1944, the Western Front was a cauldron. The Allies had landed in Normandy 6 months earlier. Operation Overlord had opened the floodgates of men and material. Nearly 2.1 million Allied troops in France by late summer, with 530,000 vehicles and more than 3 million tons of supplies pouring in through the ports of Cherbourg and the artificial harbors of Mulberry. U.S. Army Quartermaster Report 1944. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, was staggering. Its panzer divisions were hollowed out by the retreat from Normandy. Fuel shortages had paralyzed entire corps. Hitler's generals spoke of miracle weapons, but soldiers in the field saw only empty fuel drums and dwindling ammunition crates. German Army General Staff Diary, Sept. 1944. The city of Aachen became a symbol of this brutal shift. Defended by the seasoned troops of the 116th Panzer Division and the 246th Volksgrenadier Division, its streets turned into killing zones of sniper fire and rubble barricades. American infantry of the 1st Division and 30th Division ground forward yard by yard, against defenders who swore they would never surrender a German city to the invader. Yet on October 21, 1944, Aachen fell, the first German city to be captured. It was a shattering psychological blow for the Reich. After Action Report 1st Infantry Division, Oct. 1944. The cost was severe. Thousands of civilians had sheltered in cellars for weeks, many emerging half-starved, clutching what remained of their possessions. To them, the Americans were at once conquerors and saviors. The GIs had their own scars. Many had fought since Normandy, some since North Africa. They carried exhaustion in their bones, but in moments when rations were divided, and a Hershey bar or a stick of Wrigley's gum was slipped into a child's hand, a brief spark of normalcy flickered in the darkness of war. Veteran Oral History, Library of Congress. The deeper context, however, lay in the machinery of Allied supply. By 1944, the United States military had perfected the art of mass production, not only of weapons but of comforts. Millions of field rations included small luxuries, powdered coffee, cigarettes, chocolate, gum. These were not trivial. They were engineered to boost morale, to remind soldiers of home, to sustain endurance. Manufactured by Hershey, Wrigley, and countless American workers on the home front, these small items became tools of soft power when handed to civilians. U.S. War Production Board Report 1944. German families who had bartered black bread and ersatz coffee for years could hardly fathom such abundance. The disbelief was genuine. Could these men, trained killers on the battlefield, truly care for German children? For the civilians, the answer was wrapped in foil and sugar. For the Americans, it was the smallest way to reclaim their own humanity. A rifleman might see his own son's face in the dirt-smeared cheeks of a boy in Aachen. A tanker might hand over his ration gum to a little girl and whisper, in broken German, Friede, peace, Soldier Letter 1944. Yet beneath this fragile compassion, the war thundered on. Only days later, Hitler unleashed his last gamble. The Ardennes offensive, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, German armor punched into the thinly held American lines in Belgium and Luxembourg. Snowstorms grounded Allied air power. Thousands of GIs were surrounded. In towns like Bastogne, men froze, fought and bled. German propaganda declared that the Allies were breaking apart. But still, in captured villages, American soldiers, if they had anything left, would give their last chocolate to a child hiding in a barn. U.S. Army Signal Corps, Jan 1945. It was an act both simple and strategic. Feeding a child was a gesture that planted seeds of surrender, of acceptance. It showed civilians that the Reich's promises were lies. Even as Allied bombers shattered cities from Cologne to Dresden, on the ground, face to face, the smallest kindnesses eroded decades of indoctrination. A Psychological Warfare Division Report, 1945. The winter of 1944-45 would stretch on with unimaginable brutality. The Ardennes was soaked in blood. German counterattacks were crushed, but at immense cost. Nearly 90,000 American casualties, 100,000 German. U.S. Army official statistics, 1945. Yet for many civilians, the memory that endured was not of tanks grinding down frozen roads, but of the day an American kneeling in the rubble opened his pack, and from a world of plenty, handed them a taste of sweetness. It was the first crack of light after years of darkness. And behind that moment lay a deeper truth, a truth that would only become clear in the technical heart of Allied logistics, in the staggering scale of production that made such gestures possible, and in the way America's factories fought a war as surely as its divisions did in the field. That hidden advantage would soon be revealed, reshaping battles, breaking German morale, and setting the course of victory. January 23, 1945. The snow had turned to a grey crust over the Ardennes. Charred vehicles lay scattered like burnt husks, their steel twisted by fire and frost. In the silence after the German counteroffensive had been broken, American convoys rolled eastward again. Engines growled through ruined villages, their headlights masked. Children watched from doorways, faces pale with hunger. And again soldiers reached into ration bags, not for bullets or grenades, but for chocolate bars, gum, or cans of condensed milk. To civilians who had endured years of deprivation, it felt like a miracle. Yet behind this small act of kindness lay a vast, hidden machine, the logistical and industrial juggernaut of the United States, capable of feeding its own armies and, almost casually, softening the hearts of those it conquered. U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps Report, Jan 1945. The secret factor was abundance, and the engineering that made it mobile. While the Wehrmacht struggled to keep its panzer divisions fueled, American soldiers carried not only ammunition, but luxuries. Each K-ration contained a 4-ounce Hershey bar, specially formulated to resist melting, along with chewing gum, instant coffee, sugar tablets, and canned meat. Technical Manual TM 10407, 1943. The gum was Wrigley's, shipped in billions of sticks from Chicago. The chocolate came from Hershey, where chemists had designed a high-calorie bar that could survive a battlefield. Engineers like Samuel Hinkle perfected the D ration, a bitter, vitamin-fortified bar meant to sustain life in emergencies, but it was the sweeter tropical bar and regular Hershey's that children remembered. U.S. Army Quartermaster Food and Container Institute Report 1942. German soldiers, reading captured rations, were stunned by the contents. Their own field packs often held only black bread, ersatz sausage or thin potato soup. The Americans eat like kings, one captured grenadier admitted. Dramatized composite. Interrogation report, 2nd Armored Division, Deck 1944. Allied commanders knew it was more than sustenance. It was a morale weapon. A soldier's spirit was reinforced by a taste of home, and when shared with civilians, it undermined years of propaganda. Chocolate and gum were edible proof that the enemy was not the monster Berlin had described. Psychological Warfare Division Bulletin 1945. The supply chain that made this possible was unprecedented in scale. By 1944, American factories were producing 24 million Hershey bars per week, while Wrigley devoted entire production lines to military contracts. War Production Board Report 1944. Railroads and Liberty ships carried them across oceans. Trucks of the Red Ball Express, driven largely by African-American soldiers, hauled them through France at a staggering rate, one truck every 50 seconds on the supply route. Quartermaster Corps Transportation Report, 1944. It was not only tanks and shells that poured into Europe, but sweetness wrapped in silver foil. A child in Aachen or Bastogne could not know the names of Detroit assembly lines or Pennsylvania chocolate engineers, yet their first taste of freedom carried the flavor of American industry. One decisive battle where this hidden advantage manifested was Bastogne. In December 1944, the 101st Airborne Division was encircled in the Ardennes, short on ammunition and food. German artillery pounded the town. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Rations were cut to the bone. Yet even then, supply drops by the U.S. Army Air Forces included not only cartridges and plasma, but crates of chocolate and gum. U.S. Army Air Forces Supply Drop Report, Tech 1944. Soldiers tore open the packages, ate what they could, and often shared with the civilians who had sheltered in cellars beneath the burning town. For children huddled in the dark, the sound of wrappers tearing was as reassuring as the roar of inbound thunderbolts overhead. When General Heinrich von Luttwitz demanded surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe famously replied with one word: nuts. 101st Airborne Division Records, Dec 1944. But it was not only defiance that sustained the defenders. It was the knowledge that their logistics, airdrops, convoys, the industrial web across the Atlantic, would not fail them. In contrast, German units ran dry. Panzer crews abandoned tanks on frozen roads, their fuel drums empty. Volksgrenadiers scrounged for food in barns. "We starve, they feast," one captured soldier said bitterly. Dramatized composite. Intelligence Bulletin, Jan 1945. The specifications of these soft weapons were as carefully engineered as any rifle. The D-ration bar contained 600 calories, designed to sustain a soldier for a day if necessary. The tropical bar could withstand 120 degrees Fahrenheit without melting, critical for campaigns from North Africa to the Pacific. Quartermaster Technical Bulletin, 1943. Wrigley's gum not only freshened breath, but eased thirst and calmed nerves in combat. Even the packaging was strategic. Foil wrappers doubled as reflective surfaces for signaling, and tins could be repurposed by soldiers in the field. Ordnance Field Notes, 1944. Every detail reflected the meticulous planning of American engineers and the labor of millions of workers, men and women, on the home front. For German civilians, encountering this abundance was jarring. Say a 10-year-old boy in Cologne later recalled, "We thought it was poison. We had been told the Americans would kill us. But it was sweet, sweeter than anything I had ever tasted." Dramatized testimony. Bundesarchiv. Civilian interviews, 1946. A mother in Aachen wept when her child unwrapped gum, whispering that it smelled like another world. For soldiers who handed it out, it was a bridge. Many could not speak German, but candy and gum required no translation. GI Memoir, 1945. Even the enemy command took notice. Reports from the Sicherheitsdienst, SD, warned that American troops were corrupting German civilians with gifts. SD Intelligence Summary, Feb 1945. Nazi officials urged harsher discipline, but the tide was irreversible. In occupied towns, rumors spread. The Americans brought food, the Americans shared. No leaflet from Goebbels could erase the taste of chocolate from a starving child's tongue. The Battle of Bastogne ended in Allied relief on December 26th, when Patton's Third Army broke through with tanks and trucks laden with supplies. Among the first items distributed were rations that included chocolate and gum. To the exhausted civilians, it was a symbol that survival had returned. To the GIs, it was proof that their logistical chain could overcome even encirclement. Third Army Logistics Report, Dec 1944. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, left behind diaries filled with despair. "We march on empty stomachs. The Americans give chocolate to children. What chance do we have?" Dramatized composite. Captured diary, 5th Panzer Army, Jan 1945. By the spring of 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine and advanced deep into Germany, this pattern repeated. Wherever convoys rolled, children emerged. Soldiers carried rifles in one hand, chocolate in the other. And civilians, conditioned for years to see only cruelty, began to realize that the war was lost. not only in the fields and skies but in the hearts of their own children, who now associated the enemy with sweetness and survival. Psychological Warfare Division Report, April 1945. The hidden advantage was not merely firepower. It was a cultural weapon. Logistics harnessed to compassion, industry transformed into influence. The Americans could fight with steel, but they also fought with sugar. And in a war of annihilation, even such gestures could break the will of a nation. The full impact of this soft power, however, would only become clear in the months that followed, when entire campaigns were shaped not just by bombs and bullets, but by the morale of nations brought to their knees. April 30th, 1945, the guns of Berlin thundered their last, and the Reichstag shuddered under the weight of Soviet artillery. In the West, American convoys wound through shattered German towns, where civilians lined the roads in silence. The Wehrmacht was collapsing, its commanders surrendering by the tens of thousands. But even in these final weeks, one enduring image remained etched into the memory of survivors. American soldiers kneeling to hand chocolate and gum to children who had only known war. To many, this was more than food. It was a revelation that the enemy was not the monster they had been taught to fear, but the messenger of an unimaginable future. U.S. Army Signal Corps Report, May 1945. The strategic impact of these small acts was immense. Warfare is not fought only in trenches and skies. It is fought in the minds of the living. American abundance, carried in crates and ration packs, contrasted starkly with German scarcity. Soldiers in grey uniforms scrounged in fields for potatoes, while civilians boiled weeds to fill their stomachs. Yet American GIs carried enough not only to fight, but to give away. That imbalance, industrial, logistical, psychological, told a story louder than propaganda. It told the German people that the Reich had failed them. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The logistics that sustained this soft power were as critical as any battle plan. The Red Ball Express had delivered more than 412,000 tons of supplies from Normandy to the front between August and November 1944. Quartermaster Transportation Corps, 1945. Within those convoys, cases of Hershey's chocolate and Wrigley's gum rode alongside gasoline and artillery shells. Engineers in Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Michigan labored day and night to ensure production never faltered. Hershey's alone produced over 3 billion ration bars by war's end. War Production Board Report, 1945. Wrigley shifted nearly all gum production to the military, branding its products for the armed forces only. Even factories that once produced toys or furniture were retooled to make ration packaging, foil, and containers. Every civilian gift was backed by an army of unseen workers. The psychological effects extended beyond the front lines. After Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, the occupation forces faced a shattered society. Cities lay in ruins, industry gutted, millions displaced. Hunger was rampant. The U.S. Army launched massive feeding programs, distributing tons of flour, milk, and canned goods. But the moments civilians remembered most were often smaller. A stick of gum pressed into a dirty hand, a bar of chocolate shared on a doorstep. It was the first time we realized there could be kindness again, one woman from Frankfurt recalled. Dramatized testimony, Bundesarchiv, Civilian Interviews, 1947, Axis despair was equally profound. In post-war interrogations, German officers admitted that the sheer abundance of American supplies had broken morale long before unconditional surrender. Our men saw what the Americans carried, one officer of the 352nd Infantry Division confessed. They fought on full stomachs, with coffee, with cigarettes, with chocolate. We fought on nothing. How could we believe we would win? Dramatized composite, U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey Interrogations, 1946. Psychological warfare was not merely leaflets dropped from planes. It was lived every day in every occupied village, when children tasted the sweetness of defeat. The human cost behind these gestures cannot be overlooked. Engineers perfected rations, but it was GIs on the ground who chose to share them, often at personal sacrifice. A soldier in the 29th Infantry Division wrote home, "I gave away my chocolate to a boy today. I don't regret it, but I will go hungry tonight." Letter, June 1945. Medics distributed gum to calm crying children during field surgeries. Tank crews slipped Hershey bars to orphans hiding near bridges. These were not random acts of charity. They became part of the fabric of occupation, a silent campaign of reconciliation amidst ruins. The legacy stretched beyond the war's end. When the Berlin blockade cut the city off in 1948, American pilots, many veterans of the campaigns in Germany, remembered those moments. They dropped not only flour and coal, but candy parachutes for children, earning the nickname Candy Bombers. U.S. Air Force Berlin Airlift Report, 1949. The memory of chocolate and gum in 1945 carried into the Cold War, becoming a tool of diplomacy. The message was clear. America was not only a conqueror but a provider, capable of sustaining allies and reshaping hearts. This philosophy endured into modern warfare. In Korea, Vietnam, and Iraq, U.S. forces distributed food, candy, and small comforts to civilians, continuing a tradition born in Europe. Military doctrine recognized that victory required more than destruction of enemy forces. It demanded legitimacy, acceptance, and even gratitude from civilians. The gift of gum in Aachen, the bar of chocolate in Cologne became early lessons in what would later be called hearts and minds operations. U.S. Army Civil Affairs Doctrine, 1955. The industrial foundations were equally influential. The coordination of engineers, chemists, and factory workers who had produced the wartime rations became a model for post-war American power. Cold War planners understood that logistics, the ability to deliver not only bombs but comforts, was a decisive weapon. The lesson echoed into the Gulf War, where MREs, meals ready to eat, included candy and snacks, both for soldiers and occasionally for civilians in need. The lineage traced directly back to the Hershey bars and Wrigley's gum of 1944, Defense Logistics Agency Report, 1991. For the veterans, these moments lingered in memory. Decades later, men who had fought through Normandy, the Ardennes, and the Rhineland recalled not only the firefights and artillery barrages, but the faces of children tasting chocolate for the first time. "It was the only time I felt like I brought a little light into that darkness," one GI said. Dramatized testimony, Veteran Oral History, 1982. For the children, those gestures were unforgettable. Many later testified that the day an American soldier gave them candy was the day they realized the war was truly ending. The war left scars that no sweetness could erase. Cities lay in ashes, millions dead. But in the rubble, the act of sharing food carried symbolic weight. It was the first thread of reconciliation, binding conqueror and conquered in fragile humanity. It showed that even in total war, compassion could pierce through steel and fire. By May 1945, the Reich had collapsed under the weight of Allied industry, strategy, and arms. Yet for many German civilians, surrender was not first experienced through the thunder of artillery or the signing of documents in Reims. It was tasted on the tongue, in chocolate, in gum, in the sweetness of survival. Psychological Warfare Division Report, 1946. As the last shots of World War II faded, one universal lesson remained. In modern war, victory belongs not only to those who wield the heaviest guns, but to those who can sustain life, restore dignity, and win the hearts of the defeated. Or as one American GI scribbled in his diary in May 1945, "We fought with rifles, but we conquered with chocolate.